And I think Raymond is the future daughter-in-law's father?
My future daughter-in-law, yeah.
Future daughter-in-law's father, right?
Fiance's father.
Father. So whether they're going to be friends or not, it's going to be way too easy for me to say.
Charles is friends with everyone.
And you know, Garth talks a lot about his family, and he mentions Johnny. And Clint wants me to make it clear that he is not the Johnny that Garth refers to. He was actually was a good kid all along, didn't go through those issues. Johnny turned out good in the end, we know, but Clint was kind of just always good. So.
Well, I like the way Garth says he has 3 kids. Their names all start with K. Clint, Jim, John.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, so good to have Clint here with us today. I, was asked if maybe I could come up with a lesson, and so I think it's good we do that now and then. We ask people from the congregation, hey, what's on your heart? Let's hear what you want to study. And it just came to me that maybe it's a good time for us to go back to the basics and look at Exodus. It's a very interesting book. A lot of Americans don't really study Exodus that much because we have the movie. We have the Ten Commandments movie. We've seen Charlton Heston. We think, what else is there to really know? But there's a lot in this book that I think we need to just pause and look at, and maybe it's good for our own introspection. Kathy and I try to do our own Bible study, and we've been reading along, and not that long ago we were in 1 Kings. And in 1 Kings 19, you remember Elijah has gotten scared, and he's gone off, and he's living in the cave, right? And God comes to him. Remember what God says to Elijah when he's in the cave? What's the first thing God says to him? Exactly, very good. She's quite the Bible scholar. Exactly. God says to him, what are you doing here? And he says, well, God, blah, blah, blah. And then God says, what are you doing here? Right? So that's exactly right. So I think thinking about what are you doing here is a good lesson we get from Exodus, both as to looking at their lives and then applying it to our lives. And how often do we stop and think, what am I doing here? Whether that be the job we're in, the community we're in, the congregation we're in, what am I doing here? Right? And that the fact that God would ask you that, like, what exactly are you up to and why? And this is a good perspective for us to have in the book of Exodus. So if we go to the beginning of Exodus, let's take a look at it and see what we can learn from this. Let's have somebody read for us Exodus 1 through verse 9. A lot goes on in those first 9 verses here to set the story.
What are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt? They came to each one with his household. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. All of the persons who came from the land of Jacob were 70, and none of Joseph was already in Egypt. Joseph died, and all his brothers and all his generations. And the sons of Israel were fruitful, and increased greatly, and multitudes became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. Now a new king arose over Egypt, who did not know Moses. He said to the people, behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more than
Okay, good. So we have the specific names, and we're given a specific number of people that come. It seems interesting. This book is interesting in many respects, the way it's written, but it jumps right into the story. It assumes you know the previous story of Joseph, right? And it says Joseph and his descendants are dead. What's the high points of Joseph? How is it that they come to be in this place? Again, one of our focuses is, what are you doing here? So how did they come to be there? Yeah, what are they doing in Egypt? How they happen to be there?
famine.
Okay, famine, and what about Joseph? What had happened?
Hi, this is Mike Ackerman with a few words about St.
Yeah, so Joseph had been a big man, right? He had become basically in charge of the country, especially the famine relief program. He's put in charge of it, and it says, if you read that account, he basically tells his family, I'm kind of in charge. I'm the number one guy here. And then what does Joseph say? Why? How does that happen to be? Because he's so doggone smart, and he's just got cunning and skill, and he worked so hard his whole life. Is that what Joseph says? Is that how he ends up in that place? What does Joseph say? Who does he give credit to that? Yeah, God. He says, this is God's plan. So when it comes time to take revenge on his brothers even, he says, I'm not going to take revenge on you. This is all part of God's plan. I'm supposed to be here, right? So if we'd ask Joseph, what are you doing here? Joseph says, I'm where God wants me to be. This is all part of God's plan. It was a rough road that he went through to get there, wasn't it? Imprisoned, falsely accused. He learned some skills running Potiphar's farm operations, and then he becomes in charge of the entire place because of his godliness, because of his ability to interpret the dreams, because he's going to use God as his reference point, not manly wisdom. The Pharaoh even recognizes, man, there is something about this guy, right? So he gets to be there. So his family comes, and about how much time do you think's gone by? What hint do we have even here as to what kind of time has gone by?
First, let's look at the 50 days of Easter, as explained on the website.
Yeah, that's going to be the right answer, is that it's been about 400 years they're there, right? And one of the hints we have here is that in verse 8, in a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing. So, first of all, if it's been 400 years and finally somebody comes around and says, you know what, I don't care about that guy Joseph, what a shadow Joseph threw. For 300 and some odd years, the kings all knew, hey, this Joseph guy, he's something else, right? I mean, look at our country is going to come up on our 250th anniversary, and most of us know quite a few of the founders, but there's a lot of them that's names we might go, was that a president or a founder? I don't know, and it hasn't been 400 years yet. So if it was that long and people still knew who Joseph was up until this point, so finally a new king comes along and says, you know, I'm not so sure that Joseph guy is all that important. In fact, I see a detriment to having all these Jewish people here. What's the detriment he points out?
Controversies, persecution, and miracles all testify
Yeah,
to the continued
too numerous.
presence of the
So
Lord Christ
in the Bible we know having a numerous amount of ancestors or children of heirs is a good thing, right? God is blessing them. So we know a little bit. We can tell a little bit from history here. We know the timeline of when this all occurred, actually. In fact, it's under Ramses II. The timeline's hard to see, but just know you can look up the timeline. And there's lots of debates that occurred with educated people for a long time, but modern day archaeology has done a lot to burn off some of the fog and the mystery. And Ramses II is whose time frame we think this is, and the Bible goes on to be very specific about what's going to happen with him. So, by the way, Ramses II, if you want to know what he looked like, that's a carving that was of Ramses. He was said to have been lighter skinned. He would have looked more white, air quotes, I guess, is probably what their own writings say about him. He was a fair-skinned person, had a little bit more facial features. In this example, he looks a little bit more white, but if you notice some of the other carvings, he looks very African-American, we would say, like African-American. We like to throw American on, but he looks a little bit more of what we think a traditional African person would look like. But the writings actually say he was a fair-skinned person, and he thought he had a pretty good high opinion of himself. So he, of course, made sure his body was mummified because they believed that. And if you want to see how he's looking today, well, he could use a little moisturizer. But we actually have found his actual sarcophagus, and we have that's his actual mummified body that we have of him. Okay, so this is the time frame when all this is going on. Okay, so let's go read further, verses 10. Yes, Mary Kay, I heard that. It's Mary Kay. All right, so a little bit before we go into verse 10. So they're there because Joseph says, hey, this is all part of God's plan, but now it's gone awry. It would appear, the plan's come undone. Because this king doesn't care much about you Jews at all. It says you're kind of a pest. There's too many of you around. God had said that this was going to happen. And now how many people do you think they have there? How many people? We've all heard this in Bible lessons, and let's just make sure that it seems to hold up. About how many Israelites do you think there were at that time? Okay, 2 million. Good job, Dad. You remember your facts, and that's the number we all generally use, 2 million. You know how we get to the 2 million? Part of how we get to the 2 million is found later in the book of Exodus. In verse 1237, it counts out that there are 600,000 men of fighting age. But that's a little bit nebulous as to what fighting age means, and 600,000 is even a round number. But people who have done the genealogical type research say it's very realistic they would have had at least 2 million at that day and time. Their generations lasted about 18 years in that particular time frame. And as we know, the Bible even says they were amazingly fruitful. There's a lot of them. So even with the efforts to try to slow them down, it's probably between 2.4 to 3 million people is a conservative estimate with modern day science, if you will. So the Bible's been making that kind of point, and now people who study, anthropology and all of that, they go, well, yeah, that's very realistic. So just from the 70, remember it starts off saying there's 70 of them, they've now turned into 2.4 million. Wow, right? That's quite an impressive fact as to what's occurred. And we can even show you some of the formulas, and if you go through as to how many marriages that would have actually, some people say they would have arrived at that number much earlier than this. So it's the fact that it's tough being a slave, right? They've been turned into slavery. They're having a lot of probably child mortality, infant mortality, and other issues because they're not being treated even as well as the Egyptians are able to treat themselves. So very realistic, though. There's 2 million people that we're talking about here. Okay, so now let's read from verse 10 to 14. Exodus 1, verses 10 through 14. You're a good reader, Sandy.
That described the realizations he had after a profound crisis of existential meaning because of the prospect of death. This was followed by a study of the Gospels in which he recognized that with the risen one, I know why I live. And here's the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Personally, thanks to this turning point of faith, I was able to continually proclaim the risen one, and in this way propose, as Pope Paul VI said, Christianity is joy, as continuous striving to supersede the stalemate of suffering without an outlook. The Lord Jesus is for me, he who made me meet along my journey hundreds of brothers and sisters.
So they come up with a national policy, right, about this. And what's the national policy they adopt?
The resurrection from the dead,
or that Pharaoh implements?
in Germany. In this community, wrote Father, a new form of popular piety by his grace was sketched
Yeah,
out.
going to enslave the Jews. Going to put them, going to make sure that they are enslaved, and they're going to work them hard. This ever happened any other time in Jewish history?
The 5 continents. It
If you study
celebrated
the Holocaust, Holocaust we all remember because it's relatively recent, but believe it or not, if you study the history of the Jewish people, and there's books written on this happens to them again and again and again. In England, the English kings get mad at them and basically expel them and put them in exile and take away their businesses and try to hold them down. It's happened throughout history that the Jewish people have other groups of nationalities that give them a hard time. Most recently, we just had the Palestinians and the Jews, right? I mean, they tend to be picked on, if you will, or abused, or people put policies in place that's meant to hold them down. And every time that's happened, it results in a boom and an expansion for the Jewish people. They become more prominent and they survive, and those who survive end up coming forward. It tells us something even about national policies, right? Put a national policy in place to try to oppress some people. What about national policies trying to oppress Christianity? Christianity do better or worse during times of persecution? Way up, right? Why is that? I don't know, something about human nature, right? Human nature, if you say you can't do something, we're going to do it. And under persecution, it says there must be something to this, so they wouldn't be persecuting us. Right now, in places like China, even in the Middle East, and some places where it's being, they're severely persecuting Christians, Christianity is actually flourishing, and those who are involved in Christianity are stronger and more faithful than ever. So there's something God knows about us. Now, how did we talked in the beginning, we're talking using the reference point from 1 Kings 19, when God comes to Elijah and says, what are you doing here in the cave, right? And the Jewish people need to find out, what do we do in here? We said, well, one of the reasons they're there is because Joseph. So they could be feeling really bad about this, right? I mean, Joseph came here, helped these people out, saved them from the famine. We were, we did nothing wrong. We were invited here, everybody. Hello. And now you're treating us like these slaves. This is awful. God's plan has come all undone, and this is a terrible plan. And it's amazing for us to look back and realize this actually had been prophesied, right? God had actually said this. Who did God tell this very scenario to? Somebody look up Genesis 15, verses 13 and 14.
From the darkness of sin to the bright radiance of the light of grace.
And I used to have a professor at Michigan Christian College, and he'd say, now and then it's okay to say, wow. Or, to just say, this time just to say, wow. So look at Genesis 15, verses 13 and 14.
Celebrated in
Kathy, yeah?
knowledge of the gospel text can effectively convey a moving understanding to the faithful of the second moment of the Paschal event, namely the Lord's resurrection. Theologius is potentially an excellent teacher of the faith, since, quote, per crucem ad lucium, through the cross one comes to life. Using the metaphor
So,
of journey,
it looks like God's plans all come unraveled. This is something's gone horribly wrong. Joseph was supposed to be here. We were going to get, remember even the original invitation is that tell your people to come and they don't even need to bring anything with them because they're going to have the best of Egypt. Don't even bother. Don't bring the lazy boy. Don't pack up the U-Haul. You don't need that silly little flat screen television you got because when you get to Egypt, we're giving you the best of everything. Fully appointed places. That's what the message, that's the invitation that had come out. And now they end up in servant or slavery, and the Jewish people could be saying, God's plan has come all undone. When you realize that God had predicted this to Abram and told him it was going to be Abraham, tells him this is what's going to happen. And it happens, you think, well then the fact that Joseph was treated poorly by his brothers and was sold into slavery and becomes in Potiphar's house and becomes, you mean God was looking ahead and said this exact level of events has to occur just this way in order for them to be here and for this to all unfold? Jeff?
To emphasize the complementarity between the stations of the cross via Crucis and the stations of the resurrection via Lucis. In spite of continuing local variability, there appears to be an increasing convergence upon the following 14 as an accepted list of stations of the resurrection. These 14 stations, in fact, appeared in the April 2015 edition of Magnificat.
Excellent point. So God's plan isn't the way we would write it as man, right? We would say, you know, the plan's going to be Joseph goes, he's a big-time star, they get the best of everything, they get this tremendous buffet every day, everything's wonderful, they get all fattened up, get the best medical care, and move to a brand new location where everything's great. That's the way we'd like it to be, right? God says, no, your people, I just often, Kathy and I, we read our Bible, and I'll just, you know, politely pretend like I'm the person God's talking to. About that slavery of my people for 400 years, can we just unpack that a little bit? So God often says things to people, and he throws it in, there's going to be this really horrible thing, and you're going to, it's okay, and they'll come through it. You go, can we maybe not have that really horrible part there? Obviously not, right? God says, this is going to happen. Why might God have wanted that to happen? Or why did God have that in his plan? And Jack's point about prayer even. What does this say about the way God answers our prayers? We say, God, I need a new car to be able to be a better Christian, and I've been looking at a new Jaguar F-Type, and I really think they're great. And if you don't mind, God, I'd like to have one of those. And we don't even get any new car next week. And we go, God, I really thought I gave you a specific thing I needed here. Yeah. Mary Magdalene proclaiming the resurrection to the beloved disciple. Jesus appearing to over 500 at once. Also, Jesus appearing to Saul. I hope you enjoyed this program. I love learning about the villages, the stations of the resurrection, and I think it would be really great to organize a pilgrimage to the Holy Land based on these stations. Thanks for being with me. I hope you have a wonderful day.
They were always treated for the always done. Very nice. And it was awesome. And so we've done things aren't going to break your week. Don't worry. God is our last orders. Or to check out Joe's blog and ask her a question. So about the work, right? They're going to get worked to death. We have a little bit of evidence on that. We have many different pictures, and by the way, we now can read hieroglyphics. I think all of us got that memo in high school, even that now we can read it, and they're going back and studying. There's still so much Egyptian writing. They're not done even cataloging it all, but they've been able to go through and they're reading it now, and all of the stuff has been chronicled. And by the way, a lot of the biblical skeptics, even in the 1800s, and people at Harvard and other places, were like, well, I think some of these stories are just stories. Now we go into even the 1900s and we start to go, well, maybe these stories are actually pretty specific. Good example, Menachem Begin was the head of Israel for a while, and he made a bold claim one time that, well, it's nice that us Jews helped build the pyramids. Trivia question, did the Jews build the pyramids? No, the pyramids were around way before they got there, believe it or not. Unbelievably, they were there way before they got there, and now we can read the writings, and it's like,
if our Bible said, and the Jews built the pyramids. It would be kind of a cool thing. If you're writing a fictitious story and you want to talk about slave labor, you get to throw in pyramids for good measure. Does it say in the passage we just read, and they enslaved them and they made them build the pyramids? They think it was 20 to 30,000 people working 30 years to build the pyramids.
Prayers to St. Joseph for
Wow.
the unemployed.
But it looks like they were all Egyptian farmers that were actually paid a government sum of money to go work. They didn't want foreigners there because a part of what they're going to do is hide the bodies of the people they think are gods, and they don't want anybody raiding the tombs. So they actually put people on the government dole, gave you a good job so that it beats farming for a living, and had you come work. 20 to 30,000 people for 20 to 30 years. But it doesn't say in there, right? What does it say in there that they're supposed to build? There was actually kind of hard words to read there, right? Pithom and Ramses. Pithom means, it's actually the sun god. It's a reference to the sun god. It's saying from the sun god. And Ramses, you know, we talk about Ramses. Ramses' name actually is son of Ra, right? Their god Ra. So he's supposed to be a god, right? That's why Ramses is the god of the sun. It's supposed to be connected to that. But it says specific cities that they built, right? So we have other pictures of how the workmen would have worked. What the workers, by the way, this is the type of uniforms you'd have to order for your employees if you're going to get uniform service. Cuts down on cost, Jack. You don't have to get all the shirts that have their name and then on it. You just get them a loincloth. But this is the way they worked at that time, right? Very hot. Hot to be working outside. Okay? And we've actually found, archaeological digs have found this city of Ramses, this storehouse that they were building. Pretty amazing. And guess what? There's an archaeological fact about this. It probably doesn't mean anything. It's just, you know, just the way it is. But when you look at the bricks at the lower courses of these buildings, they've got a lot of straw in the brick. And then when you get to the upper courses of the brick, guess what? No straw. So it must have just been there was a famine in the land and there was no straw. It must be what happened, right? You read the Bible and it says, this is where they built. And this is exactly what we know the story ends up happening. It's very faith affirming. This is exactly what happened to these people. This story is true. And when we go back to the, what are you doing here that we're focusing on? This was already foretold to Abraham that this very thing was going to happen. They were going to be in this region. And it's all okay. It's all going to work out. So there's lots of reasons we could even figure, right? What's this going to do to the people having this kind of hard labor and work? What's this going to mean to them when they ultimately are going to have their own place? Dad?
Yeah, to be able to say the A word that we've avoided saying. Yeah, for so long, all through Lent, we don't say that. Now we can bust out with hallelujahs and we can say He is risen. And there's a smile on people's faces, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful experience, I think. And I love Easter, especially the octave of Easter. Those 8 days that go from Easter Sunday to Divine Mercy Sunday. So we're up on Divine Mercy. It's beautiful. Now it's interesting because this year we find ourselves in the interregnum of the church, right? We're in between popes. No one planned any of this, obviously. So Pope Francis, God rest his soul, has gone to be with the Lord.
Pretty good growth, isn't it? Pretty amazing. And great point, right? In the beginning, everyone loved God's plan, right? We're going to go where there's abundant food, and we're getting the best of everything. We're getting the best locations. We're getting the houses with the view. We've got beautiful breezes that blow through our houses because the Pharaoh's given us the best land. Everybody loves God's plan then, right? This is great. And as time goes on, people are like, God must have made a mistake, or God doesn't love us. God's plan really is a bad plan, or his plans come undone. You can imagine, right? It's going to be very faith testing, right? I mean, what's going on here? We're making bricks without straw. This is unbelievable. God must be asleep, right? Would be the kinds of things that we heard taunting that was made of the pagan gods. But yet, no, this is exactly what God said was going to happen right from the beginning. Okay, any more on that? That's good thoughts, good observations? Let's go a little further. Verses 15 through 22. Exodus 1, 15 through 22 is where we're at, Ron. We're talking about Exodus.
As happens every time that we
You got that? Yep, verses 15 through 22.
we have the prophecy of St. Malachi that comes up again. And it's always, this is St. Malachi basically prophesied that there would be no popes after Pope Benedict, you know, or the Pope after Benedict would be the last Pope. You know,
You know what? One of my kids brought that up.
yeah, but there are different interpretations, and then when it happens different than the interpretation, then suddenly it's like, well, hold on, what we meant was, and then they just reinterpret things, and that's kind of all been debunked. Don't listen to stuff like that. Don't fall into the trap of those things. Just know that God's got
It was 22.
the Holy Spirit is part of it. He's in charge. This is what happens. And there were some really, I had personal experience of when Pope St. John Paul II passed away. We were going to Rome anyway with my daughter's school, had a school trip, and I was going with them. I remember this. So Bess and my wife and my daughter Emma was with us, and Megan, and we went to Rome. And it was quite beautiful. There was a consistory of cardinals.
Okay.
The new pope was selected.
Interesting things we see there. So this story's been going along and not giving a lot of names to a lot of people, but all of a sudden it gives us specifically the names of the two midwives. Isn't that interesting? Two midwives, two Egyptian, well, or Hebrew ladies, have their names mentioned specifically. God, through the writing of the Bible, gives them specific credit, right? There's times in the Bible, we know names like Rahab and other people's names, right, where God gives some people singular credit that today we can still be reading their names. But these ladies, so Pharaoh calls them and says, when the women are on the birthing stool, if it's a boy, just kill it. A lot of research and scholars have opinions on this, but one thought is that these ladies are actually Egyptian. The names are Egyptian names. They're Egyptians that are assigned to the Hebrew quarter, if you will. And they're also probably over the other midwives. Now, in this day and time, midwives actually in the pagan world, it wasn't just a surgical or medical procedure like we think of today. Science and the thinking on things like disease and medicine hadn't gotten to that point. So these people were also believed to be sort of sorcerers or witches or people who could conjure away the evil spirits, because a lot of babies died after birth. So midwives had a little bit more gravitas in their society than just a simple nurse or administrative person. They're supposed to have researched and looked into this, and they've somehow been designated as people who've got a calling, and they can deal with these pagan issues in the pagan world. Well, if they were trying to be even connected and be spiritual ladies, it could be when they've been working with these Hebrew ladies and helping them with this birthing process, something's happened. What does it say? What does it say about these two ladies?
You know, going through the death of a pope, and it dramatized some of that. It was interesting to see some of that and how
They feared God. Somewhere along the way, in interacting with people. Now, I'm not a lady and I've never given birth, and I know men should never even enter this realm of discussing it, but it doesn't seem like you'd be at your best, ladies, right? If you're going to look for a time to evangelize, right in the middle of childbirth wouldn't be a time you pick, right? You're a little distracted. It's not your best, right? You're not in your best behavior. Well, these ladies have the career of dealing with women at a very difficult time. Do you think every baby always lived after they were born? Do you think there was no complications? And yet somehow, through this interaction, they've come to believe in God. There's something about these Jewish ladies, these Hebrew ladies, right? And there's other further evidence they probably were Egyptian, because the Pharaoh calls them back and forth, and he lets them get away with having not done what he said. Now, this Pharaoh believes he's God on earth. Everybody's, propagating that propaganda for him, to where he even says later, throw all the boys in the Nile. And he's shocked if everybody doesn't just do it. I am God. I am saying all babies shall be thrown in the Nile. Pretty arrogant guy. And he's told these ladies, look, I don't want any baby boys being delivered. And by the way, if you wanted to know what the birthing stool arrangement looks like, we have examples of it, and actually birthing stool was probably a mistranslation. It was two stones that were placed close together. They were high enough up that the midwives could assist in the birthing process, and they were designated places where the midwives would be. So you go there, and they help you. They do deliver a lot of babies. It's generally, the Hebrew ladies are probably still using the service, because you hear they're not being fully honest, which is its own point for discussion, to the Pharaoh, right? We have a reason to believe they said, they feared God and they didn't follow his order. When he says, what's going on? These Hebrew ladies, they don't use the birthing stool. They just kind of have their own babies on their own.
Yeah,
But we know there was such a thing, and these midwives, notice in this even depiction, they're showing what is their equivalent of their deity, their pagan deities, right there in the birthing process. So these are sort of like priestesses. And they come in, the Pharaoh has a discussion with them, and he doesn't do anything. He doesn't punish them, it doesn't appear, right? They just say, "I'm sorry, it's just the way it goes." So then he says, "Well, all right, we don't have any evidence." He punishes them. He says, "All right, then everybody just throw the babies in the river," because they're apparently having these babies without using midwives. What does God do for these? Now, these midwives, would we say there's some evidence here maybe they were less than fully candid with the Pharaoh?
It has to be made official. So there's this like
Appears to
ceremonial
be,
thing
right?
they do, and it's
Is it ever okay to lie?
he's leading it, and basically he calls out
I'm getting it started here because I got Ron nodding no behind you, so we can have a cage match on this.
I guess.
I call Dr. Pleasant, and then you guys can form your team here. But is there other times we ever see people being less than fully candid in the Bible?
Witness this, and he calls his
How about David? When David affects being a madman, is that being fully candid, or is he now kind of being engaged in deception?
I imagine it's very dramatic.
Right? There's times when people, Rahab's fully honest. When they come to Rahab and they say, "Are there any spies here?" She says, "Yeah, right under here underneath the mats here on the roof."
I can't imagine that happening because they know.
But it appears to be there's a scaling of the dishonesty versus what? And what is the thing being saved here? It's irrelevant to our day and time. What is the boy children or babies? It was more important to save the babies, God's babies, than to be fully honest when you're forced with an autocratic person who's going to do this. So a little bit of deception appears to be tolerated. Does God just say, "You know what, they're Egyptian ladies, so their sport card doesn't count"? Does it say anything else in these verses about these ladies?
Device and just destroys it. Like either hits it with a hammer, bends it out of shape, breaks it, so it's no longer usable as a ring. Because it's a sign of his authority.
Well, you might say they're not being deceptive, they just left, right? They just left town.
Yeah, things like that.
But yeah, they didn't go along with the edict, right? They didn't follow the orders and were told other places to listen to what the government says, unless he's going to deviate from what God wants. Same thing here. God wants babies to not be killed, right?
The little seal
We can make the analogy to abortion, and I don't want to go too far with that, other than to say God values these babies, right? There's verses which I can point you to here that says that from conception, God is involved in that, right? And has made you in the womb. So God does not want them to follow Pharaoh's orders. And because they don't follow Pharaoh's orders, what does it say happens to them? They got their own families. Don't know. Apparently the people at the time might have known maybe these ladies that don't have their own families because among other things, they're up giving, you got 2 million people and they're having babies being born. I'm not sure that those are the only 2 midwives there even were, but perhaps they're the ones Pharaoh thought were the generals of the midwives, right? But they're busy, and maybe once you're relegated to that role of midwives, you don't have your own families because you can't be at home taking care of your kids. You've got all these births occurring. But God has it so they end up having their own families. All these ladies are giving birth to other people, helping them have their babies, and seeing that joy. Appears they were not going to ever be given that right. And God gives them probably on their sport card what would be the coolest thing, the thing they wanted, even more than the Jaguar one. They wanted to have a family of their own. And God says, I'm going to give that to them because they honored me. They feared me, not these other crazy deities that these people believe in. They know that I'm the true God.
Ideas, or maybe had their own and the seal bulls and kind of proclaim themselves to be
Yes, it could be. I know cars are human too, but not maybe to the same level as a baby boy. All right, so interesting, right? But so these ladies are called out by name, and God gives them a family of their own as a reward. So it appears to have not been something they would have naturally expected, but because God was pleased with them. And really, at the core, why is God pleased with them?
The papal residences, in this case residences, because I think he wasn't in there like the palace. He was in the
Right. And the mindset, especially, they believed in God, right? It points out that they feared God. They said, all this other crazy jackal heads and that. No. I think the Hebrews got it right. This is the God, right? Cool story for us there. Okay. What else do we find in that passage? Anything else?
All his stuff, any kind of writing, so they seal up his library, the papal
So we know where the story is going, right? It says all the boys that are born have to be thrown into the Nile. Okay. Ready to go to we're going to go to the second chapter. Somebody want to read? How about verses 1 through 5?
And then Camerlenko goes about the process of organizing the next steps, which include like 9 masses of mourning pretty sweet. It's another memory I have. It's a novena. Yeah, it's a novena of masses of mourning where the Universal Church mourns the passing of the Pope. Again, this is all interesting because this is all taking place with Easter Octave, the Easter Octave, which is a time of celebration. So they don't suppress the 9 masses of mourning. I've been before, but it's been a long, you're still in a Easter season, so you're still going to have these masses of mourning, but they're not. It's not like a cotillion or a party. But there is, a mass is a celebration, even if it's a solemn mass, and for a solemn reason like the death of the Pope. But the church does mourn in the midst of the joy of the resurrection. So it's just an interesting kind of duality that's happening there. But it's also quite beautiful because the church does not lose her way. Because the church knows that Jesus is risen, he is risen, he is risen indeed. The ancient saying says, and so we still celebrate that.
Pretty amazing event, right? Pretty hard to imagine having to put your baby in a basket, right? I mean, it's a terrible thought. And a lot of other Jewish ladies apparently heeded the edict and had to throw their babies in the Nile. Right? God's plan did not seem like it was going to ever come true at that point, right? Talk about dark days, right? But this mother says, I'm going to put the baby in the Nile, but I'm going to put it in a device that is not going to be just thrown in the Nile the way the Pharaoh means. We know the story, right? The baby happens to be in the right place at the right time with the sister watching it. And by having faith in God, by trying to keep this baby alive, we know it's going to end up, we're going to, if we keep studying this, we'll have to decide if Garth wants to keep going down this path, if he wants me to do it, or if we, next time I fill in, we'll keep going down this path. But we know there's a story coming, right? And we know the ending of the story. Jack?
So beautiful. I just can't get out of my mind how gorgeous it was, and how beautiful that celebration was. I wonder if all the rites are celebrated over that. So at least I know those and they have different presiders and different homilists and things like that. It was really neat, but at the same time, there's also the papal funeral that happens. It's separate from those 9 masses of mourning. Those go on, but in somewhere in the midst of all that, there's obviously the funeral, and the funeral is a beautiful opportunity for unity in the church and really in the world. Right? It's not just Catholic people. Pope St. John Paul.
Yeah, good point, right? Good point. When you look at the names of the pharaohs, there's even one of them that has a name that looks like Moses in the middle of his name because the river is coming from the river, from the water. Moses means taken out of the water. And the Moses name at that time, one of the pharaohs even has that name. So they thought of the Nile sort of as its own god, the sun and the Nile. So you're dedicating the baby, you're throwing it in the Nile. But you're right, this is a horrific practice. And they had to be saying, God, where are you? And they're praying to God, right? And they say, God, hear our prayers. I don't want to have to do this. And we have one example of how God's going to take even this terrible thing of putting a baby in the Nile is going to turn it towards part of his plan. So we'll stop there. I'm out of time. I had some verses for us that kind of confirm this. I'll just give these to you in case you want to look up any of these verses later. Acts 4:19 says you have to obey God rather than man. So as far as even the degree of deception. Proverbs 1:7 says, fear the Lord. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Proverbs 1:7. Jeremiah 1, verses 4 through 5 talks about how God knew us in the womb in the time of conception and how we were knit together and made by God. In Job 31:14 and 15, it talks again about God knowing us in the womb, that he was there when we were first created. In Psalms 139:13 and 14, it says, you formed my inner parts while I was in my mother's womb. Isaiah 44:2, that also references the fact that God made and knew the person when they were made in the womb. Isaiah 46:3 and 4, listen to me, O house of Jacob, all who remain in the house of Israel, you whom I've upheld since you were conceived and have carried since your birth, even in your old age, your gray hairs, as I am he. I am the one who sustained you. I have made you. I will carry you. I will sustain you, and I will rescue you. And then, of course, Exodus 20:13 says you shall not murder. So a higher command of not murdering these babies. Okay, great lesson. Thank you. We will continue or not, as maybe Garth decides. But thank you, and we'll have our service here in